Guys, in this video I'm talking about autism and ADHD and the hidden struggles that you don't see. All that plus a big review about a book is coming up. Hello and a salute to you. Thank you for stopping by if you're new around here and you don't know me. I am Dan. I do weekly videos on autism, Asperger syndrome, ADHD, OCD, dyslexia. If you want to learn more about those topics, make sure to hit the subscribe button by clicking that notification bell down below. And also, if you are on Instagram or Facebook, be sure to give this page a follow. Okay guys, so I actually had the opportunity and the honor of actually speaking to a gentleman called Dr. Thomas Brown, and he is the author of a book called ADHD and Asperger syndrome in smart kids and adults, which I actually have here in my hand, which I have read. Now, this book is absolutely brilliant. It's very, very interesting. This basically is a well-written, informative book that draws upon research that Dr. Brown has done in clinical experience. Basically talks about 12 individuals within this book who are on the autism spectrum or have ADHD, and he basically pulls from his experience of treating them in the clinic. And obviously they've been given pseudonyms within this book because obviously it's, breach of data and stuff. But Dr. Brown is kind of like a master of using vibrant storytelling ways to deliver very good cutting-edge research, and it's very, very interesting. Now, ADHD and Asperger syndrome in smart kids and adults offers a detailed example of individuals who have been kind of above average in their intelligence or their cognitive intelligence, but they also struggle with different things like executive function, and they've got ADHD and all these emotional regulation issues and stuff like that. It's very, very interesting. One of the things I will say about this book, which is super, super interesting, is that Dr. Brown touches on a lot of the facts of do we use the term Asperger syndrome anymore? Should we use the term Asperger syndrome anymore? So the book centers around 12 case studies of really bright kids, teens and adults, and so I've kind of picked out 3 of them which I kind of feel that I most relate to, and I feel this is a good way to discuss it in this video because I read this book. I highly recommend checking it out, and I will leave a link for this book in the description down below and in the show notes for anybody listening on the podcast. And I will also show you a clip of what I found really interesting when speaking to Dr. Brown himself on Zoom. And I'll show you that clip right now.
The thing that I try to emphasize when I'm teaching, I'm a psychologist, I'm not a physician. I don't write prescriptions for anything. But I teach doctors how to use this. For 20 years, I taught the courses at the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association.
Yeah.
And so I would teach an advanced and a basic course on ADHD. So I'm going to have a couple of hundred psychiatrists in there from all over the place. And I often would say, how much time did you spend in medical school and or your residency in learning about how to recognize and treat ADHD? And the answers range between 0 and 20 minutes.
Wow.
This is not something which is adequately covered in even the curriculum, even some of the very, very fine medical schools. Okay, so getting back to the book, I just wanted to talk about the 3 profiles, which I think are just really interesting to talk about because they kind of give dynamic perspective of a lot of the things that I feel relatable. And a lot of people on the autism spectrum, especially if you have ADHD and autism, you kind of feel a bit detached from reality and you don't feel as relatable to those people. This book alone actually has way more information than I could possibly think of in it. Not only is it showing you the individuals who have a clinical diagnosis and go to Dr. Brown for some clinical kind of assessing, and this book actually also talked about people like Temple Grandin and other really interesting, quite famous people or entrepreneurs who are on the spectrum, and how those skills from being on the spectrum actually can be used to utilize their life and their professional work, which is just absolutely amazing. And I'm always telling people, hey, it's about the things that you can do, not the things you can't do. Hold on, tea break. Whew, what it is to be British. And it's those things that I kind of really pull on. And that's what I like about this book, where it talks about Dr. Temple Grandin, who also, FYI, is a friend of mine. She's awesome. Definitely check her out. So I'm going to go through 3 of the people in this book I think are really interesting. Now, the first one is a guy called Joshua. The next person is called Bella. And then the third person is called Anthony. So Joshua suffered from social anxiety quite severely, actually. It required him to have treatment with medication. And it's interesting because this book actually touches on medication that you kind of, when you think of autism, you don't really think of medication. Is there medication that can help? What is the medication available? And how can medication be effective? Now, this is super interesting. One of the most interesting things is that Dr. Brown states in this book that a lot of medication for autistic people
is kind of like antidepressant medication, but it's in very small doses, like the lowest dose you can get, which is what I can actually relate to. I currently take a medication called duloxetine, and duloxetine is a antidepressant medication, but I take it in very small, low doses, and it helps with my ADHD and autism, which is absolutely fantastic, because in earlier times, I used to use duloxetine to treat people with Asperger syndrome, which is kind of like why they use an antidepressant, because I had a low support needs kind of autism diagnosis, which is super interesting. So Joshua had difficulties with being bullied at school. His classmates were just kind of super jealous about him, how gifted he was, because he was a musician, which also I'm a musician, which is pretty amazing, right? But then he functioned better when they moved into a new school where he could be with other students who were involved in music more, and he had more peer culture he could adapt to because the support was there in his new school, which is very similar. I had a similar experience, you know. I was a musician in school, self-taught musician, and when I found other peers who were musicians, it was amazing. I had a better time in school. But then also when I went to university, or college as you call it in America, I actually had support in college, which helped me really adapt to the peer culture, which is exactly what Joshua experiences when he moved schools in here, which is absolutely fantastic. I think that this is a really good note to notice, that having 12 profiles in a book like this, it allows you to see that you relate to so many different people, but there may be somebody that you really do relate to on a really interesting level where you go, wow, you know, this is really interesting for me. But I think more importantly, these 12 profiles allow someone, especially a mother on the spectrum or a father on the spectrum, or somebody who just wants to learn about autism and ADHD, it allows them a big perspective of what it's like for teens and adults, because a lot of the time most of the literature we find is written about kids, but this book in actual fact is written about teens and adults and children, which is very, very, very good. I'm actually really obsessed with this. So Bella is the next person I wanted to talk about. This is a very bright and creative girl who was distanced herself from her classmates and spent a lot of time kind of playing video games. And this was me in primary school. I used to play video games all the time, right? She was terrified about transitions from, you know, where she was in school to then to go from middle school to high school, and then obviously high school to further on. And I think what is interesting about this is I can totally relate to Bella here as well. You know, transitioning from primary school to secondary school for me was life-shattering. You know, like it was just so difficult. I had to kind of walk home on my own, and it was like I lived a mile away from the school. This was horrendous for me. What I found really interesting is that she responded really well to therapeutic role-playing sessions to try out different ways of interacting with other peers and having extra support from the high school support team, which is really cool, who helped prepare her for the transition, you know, into high school. Now, this is really interesting because having like role-playing games where you like role-play to kind of figure out situations for social anxiety and things like that, a lot of people forget that autistic people struggle with social situations and figuring out what social interactions to do at certain times, which is super difficult for people on the autism spectrum, right? So this really is interesting, and it relates to me. Now, the last person I'm going to talk about, and I'm really excited because I want you guys to read this book because I found it really, really interesting. You can get it on audiobook as well, I believe, and on Kindle, so if you want to get it in a digital format. I kind of like this kind of book. It takes me a while because I'm like heavily dyslexic, but I do also get audiobooks with these books just to try and improve my reading skills. Now, Anthony was obsessed with his desire to develop a relationship with a girlfriend, right? But he lacked the ability to understand how she could be less enthusiastic about her experience in dating than he was, right? So he lacked the what's called theory of mind, and this is the ability to understand and empathize with other people or another person. So it's kind of like, what is their viewpoint or what is their way of looking at things versus mine, right? So the theory of mind really caused Anthony to have an issue with this girl he was dating. And this actually caused loads of stuff. I mean, like, she put a restraining order on this guy, and then he had to, like, you know, he violated it, and he went to court and all this stuff, and the police were involved. It was a whole thing. And I do feel it for this guy, because you got to think about this. His inability to understand theory of mind or to comprehend theory of mind led him to a negative situation where people would just be looking at him, oh, he'd been jailed for being a creepy stalker, but in actual fact, this guy has a neurological condition that needs to be looked at in a way where you go, okay, well, you know, maybe I was a bit wrong in judging this person. Yes, he did violate his terms, but also everybody should have understood everything about a person before they kind of attach a legal kind of stature onto somebody. Now, this is really interesting. I think that the combination between therapy and medication can really help people on the spectrum, especially with the stuff that they struggle with that you don't really openly see. Now, what I like about this book by Dr. Brown is that it shows support systems. It shows tables of different types of medication and therapies that one can use to help with overcoming some issues that you may have on the autism spectrum. This book is just really well written, and I think one of the things that I think lacks a lot of the time in the autism world is that, like, people who write books about autism and for autistic people, they're very academic and they're not so personal in a way that this book really is. Now, this is the first time for me doing kind of like a book review, so thank you, Dr. Brown, for sponsoring this video, the very first one of doing a book review independently, solely in this book, but I highly recommend checking it out. I will leave a link for this book in the description down below. Please check it out. Dr. Brown is a very well-respected lecturer at the university he works at. The bit at the beginning with Dr. Temple Grandin and other autistic individuals is just fantastic, and the 12 profiles are just like, wow. So definitely check that out. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.